In a small, quiet village stands a large waru tree whose leaves never fall, even as the seasons change. The villagers believe that this tree is no ordinary tree. It stands beside an old cemetery, and for as long as anyone can remember, no one has dared to touch its trunk. But the tranquility is shattered when the sound of a baby crying is heard in the middle of the night. A pregnant woman appears, her face hidden, and a small child spoke. He was playing with Mbakbardara, who carried a crying baby. Terror spread. One by one, the villagers experienced nightmares and a reality even more terrifying than their dreams. Until finally, a name-long berry was called once more Sarni, and the dark secret of 20 years began to unravel. This is not just a story about ghosts. This is a story about justice. That came too late. This is the Haunted Waru Tree. On the outskirts of a village called Sambarjati stands a waru tree towering like a silent guardian. It is located right next to an old cemetery, where moss-covered gravestones and damp earth hold whispers that are never heard. The tree is always lush, as if refusing to bow to the seasons. Its leaves are dark green, even during the dry season when other plants turn yellow. The villagers have long believed that the waru tree is no ordinary tree. They call it the dwelling place of something unseen. Children are forbidden to play near it. Adults bow their heads as they pass by. No one has ever dared to touch its trunk, not even to brush a falling leaf. However, as time passed, fear became familiar. When nothing significant happened for years, the belief began to fade into a legend whispered only at night. Until one night, Danny, a night watchman who had just moved to the village a year ago, was assigned to guard the area around the village hall. His post was only 50 meters away from the waru tree. At first, everything was normal. The night wind was piercing, and the sound of crickets was his only companion. But that night was different. Around 2 in the morning, Danny felt the air change. The wind stopped. The sound of crickets disappeared. It was as if an invisible blanket was pressing down on his chest. He stood up, turned on his flashlight, and tried to look around. When the beam of light pointed toward the cemetery, his heart began to beat faster. The waru tree, its leaves were swaying, but not because of the wind. It was moving on its own, slowly, like hands beckoning. Danny swallowed hard. He stepped back and sat down again at his post. But from that moment on, his eyes never left the tree. The night felt much longer than usual. The next day, Danny asked to be excused from a night shift. His reason was simple. He wasn't feeling well, but his face was pale, and his eyes were empty, as if he was hiding something he couldn't tell anyone. As a replacement, the village had appointed Reno, a young, cheerful, and skeptical security guard. "It's just a tree, sir," he said with a laugh when given his instructions. But Reno's smile wouldn't last long. Reno's first night on duty began calmly. He brought a thermos of coffee, a small radio, and sat comfortably at the post. But around 3 in the morning, he fell asleep due to the cold and overwhelming drowsiness. In his sleep, he had a dream. In the dream, he was under the waru tree. The moonlight reflected off the leaves. From behind the fog, a pregnant woman appeared, her long hair covering her face. She stood still, then slowly opened her mouth and called, "Reno." Reno woke up with cold sweat running down his temples. His heart was racing. He tried to laugh and light a cigarette, but his hands were shaking. A few minutes later, as he tried to push the thought away, he heard the sound of a baby crying. A soft cry, as if coming from beneath the waru tree. Reno stood up, aiming his flashlight toward the sound. When the light hit the tree trunk, he saw it. A pregnant woman stood there, but her face was empty, just bare skin without eyes, a nose, or a mouth. And the baby's cries turned into sharp screams that pierced Reno's ears and made his knees go weak. He dropped the flashlight and ran into the post, locking the door from the inside, and waited for morning with his body shaking silently. The next morning, news of the incident began to spread. Reno said little, only pointing toward the waru tree with a terrified expression. But the villagers had already started talking about it. The people of Sambarjati knew. The tree never forgets. The village of Sambarjati began to tremble softly with whispers. Reno's story, though incomplete, spread from the coffee shop to the porches of residents' homes. The Waru Tree was once again the topic of conversation. People began to recall old prohibitions, old stories, and old fears that had never been resolved. A few days after Reno's night, it was Buhatty's turn to experience something that made her blood run cold. Buhatty lived alone in a simple wooden house not far from the cemetery. She was an elderly widow who often made snacks for the children. That night, she woke up to go to the kitchen, feeling thirsty and wanted to make some hot water. When she opened the kitchen door, the air inside felt extremely cold, much colder than usual. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes catching something on the floor near the stove. There was a red trail. Buhatty squinted. The trail looked like liquid. She turned on the kitchen light. The light flickered briefly before coming on fully. In front of the stove, she saw it. A red baby, naked, its body wet as if it had just been born, was crawling slowly toward her. The baby's face was unclear, but its body was shivering as if it were cold. Mrs. Hattie backed away, gasping for breath, unable to believe what she was seeing. The baby stopped and lifted its head. Its cry was soft but full of pain. Then, its body began to melt. Its skin melted like wax, blood flowing from its suddenly open eyes. The entire kitchen floor turned red. The lights went out instantly, and when Mrs. Hattie screamed, everything disappeared. She sat limp in the corner of the dark room, crying like a child. When the residents found her and calmed her down the next morning, she could only say one sentence. "The baby is melting, he's cold. He's looking for his mother." Mrs. Hattie's story spread quickly, adding to the list of unexplained incidents. But what shocked the villagers most was a small confession from Pat Carno's son, a 6-year-old boy named Rafi. Rafi was known to be cheerful and loved playing in the yard. But in the past week, he had been talking to himself often. His mother thought he was imagining things. Until one afternoon, Rafi came home carrying a dirty baby doll, with holy eyes and red stains all over its body. "Mom, I played with Mbakbardara. She was nice. She gave me this." She also brought a baby who was crying nonstop. His mother shuddered. "Who is Mbakbardara, Rafi?" "Mbakbardara. She was sitting under a big tree, whose leaves rustled even though there was no wind." Pat Carno immediately contacted the village chief and told him everything. But what made everyone fall silent wasn't just the name Mbakbardara, but a location where Rafi claimed to have been playing, under the Waru Tree. Rafi's story confirmed the fear that had been ignored all this time. There was something, or someone, behind the dense trees that was now beginning to approach the village. It wasn't just disturbing the adults. It was also calling the children. And as if that weren't enough, the next night, Masgino, the only person in the village who owned a pickup truck, experienced something strange on his way home from the night market. He was driving slowly along a narrow road near the cemetery, when suddenly the streetlights went out simultaneously. The road was pitch black, illuminated only by the headlights of his car. But what nearly caused him to crash into a tree was a shadow that appeared in the rear-view mirror. A woman was standing in the back of his truck. Her hair covered her face, her clothes were torn, and she was smiling. A wide smile that didn't move, didn't blink, and made no sense. Her face was covered in blood. Gino slammed on the brakes. He turned around. Nothing was there. But when he looked back ahead, the figure was already standing in the middle of the road. He jerked the steering wheel, nearly veering into the gutter. When he finally stopped and got out of the car, the street was empty again. But the rear-view mirror was cracked, and on its surface was written in faint red lines, "Sarni." No one believed the story was a figment of the imagination anymore. Residents grew fearful, keeping watch and searching for answers. But one name began to be whispered. Sarni. Who was she? And why had she returned now? Among the stories circulating, many residents began locking their homes earlier. The village roads, which were usually filled with the sound of people chatting until midnight, were now silent before the call to prayer. Children were forbidden to go out, and even a guard dog that usually howled every night suddenly disappeared without a trace. However, the terror has not ended. Pac Dardo, a middle-aged man who usually cleans a mosque every dawn, experienced an incident that made him unwilling to approach the sacred place again. That dawn, he woke up as usual, put on a sarong, and carried a broom. However, upon arriving at the mosque, his steps halted. The mosque door was slightly open. He was certain he had closed it the night before. Carefully, he pushed the door. A foul odor immediately filled the air. Not the usual smell of decay, but a stench that made his throat convulse. It was a mix of rotten blood, damp grave soil, and putrid flesh. He covered his nose with a sarong and stepped inside. There was no one there. But near the mihrab, something was standing. A woman's figure, her back facing Pakdardo. Her long hair hung down to floor. Her dress was white and dirty like a shroud that had been dragged through mud. Her hands hung limply at her sides. She made no sound. Pakdardo called out, "Ma'am, who's there?" But the woman did not respond. She just stood there silently. As Pakdardo stepped back and was about to turn around, the figure slowly turned its head halfway. Half of her face was visible, and there no eyes, only gaping black holes, and blood was flowing from the corners of her lips, which were curled into a small smile. Pakdardo screamed and ran out. After that day, he never returned to the mosque, and no one blamed him. At Mbak Kenza's house, an elderly woman considered the village's traditional guardian. These stories were heard in silence. She was not surprised, only keeping everything in her deep, empty gaze. But that night, she called the village chief and several other elderly villagers. With a hoarse, soft voice, she began to uncover the buried past. "Do you remember Sarni?" she asked. Some of the elderly villagers looked at each other. That name had not been mentioned in a long time. Too long. Sarni was the eldest daughter of Mbajalal. She used to live behind the fields. An orphan since her teens. Beautiful, but shy. She didn't say much. 20 years ago, she was found hanging from the Waru Tree, 8 months pregnant. People said she committed suicide, but I know it wasn't that. Everyone in the room fell silent. Mbak Ken continued. There was no investigation. No questions were asked. The village chief at the time kept his mouth shut. Sarni was buried, and everyone went on with their lives as if nothing had happened. The village chief asked softly, "Do you know who the father of that child is?" Mbak Ken stared at him for a long time before whispering, "He knows. That man knows." But he remained silent. And now Sarni has returned. She's asking for something that was never given. Justice. The news of the conversation spread like wildfire. The villagers began to recall who had been close to Sarni in the past. One name slowly emerged from the haze of their memories. Pak Samsel. He was now a religious leader in the village. Respected, revered, and often led religious gatherings at the village hall. But in the past, he was just an unemployed young man who was often seen hanging around Sarni's house. There was no evidence, only whispers. But a chill began to surround Pak Samsel's house. People began to notice that since the story about Sarni emerged, Pak Samsel's face had changed. He became quieter, easily startled, and sometimes talked to himself on the street. And when Pak Karno's son, little Rafi, suddenly whispered in his mother's ear that night, the story turned into something that could no longer be silenced. Back Sarni said she was waiting for Pak Samsel under the big tree. Her baby is cold. Mr. Samsel sat in the living room of his house, staring blankly at the television, which was on but silent. His face looked thinner than usual. His eyes were sunken, and his hands were shaking even though the night air was not as cold as usual. Since the news about Sarni had spread again, sleep had become a luxury he no longer had. He heard whispers, sometimes from the kitchen, sometimes from inside the bathroom, but most often they came from near the window of his bedroom. A baby crying. At first it was soft like a normal cry, but gradually it turned into a painful cry, like a small chest crying incessantly in the rain. He tried to recite a prayer, but when the sound did not disappear even though he continued to recite verses, he began to doubt many things, including himself. His wife had moved to her sister's house 2 days ago. She had asked to go, saying she wanted to pray in peace. But in truth, he was afraid his wife would see or hear what was beginning to surround the house. That night, around 11 o'clock, Pak Karno returned from the mosque, passing through a narrow alley that divided the resident houses. When he passed in front of Pak Samsul's house, he stopped. Drizzle was falling, but his eyes did not blink. On the porch of Pak Samsul's house stood a pregnant woman. Her belly was large and prominent. Her hair was wet and stuck to her face. Her clothes were torn. But what made Pak Karno freeze was that the woman was carrying something in her arms. A baby. The baby was wriggling gently in a worn white cloth. But through the gap in the cloth, Pak Karno could see the baby's wet red skin and eyes, staring straight at him. The woman did not move. She just stood there. Her gaze was fixed on the window of the house. Then, slowly, the woman's head turned, not her body, just her head, turning like it was broken, until finally, her eyes met Mr. Karno's. Mr. Karno took 2 steps back before running away without looking back. He didn't know when the figure disappeared. But since that night, he knew that the Waru Tree was no longer the only place of terror. Now, Sarni had entered the house. The next day, the rumors grew louder. Some villagers claimed to have seen Pak Samsul talking to himself in the yard. Others heard the sound of a baby crying from inside the house, even though it was locked tight. Pak Samsul grew increasingly reclusive. If he was seen at all, he would keep his head down, walk quickly, and avoid every gaze. Then Friday night arrived. Pak Samsul tried to escape. He sped his motorcycle out of the village through a back road in the fields. But about 2 kilometers from the village gate, a large tree suddenly fell, blocking the road. The motorcycle he was riding suddenly stalled. Even though it had shown no signs of trouble earlier, he tried to start again several times. No luck. Darkness began to engulf the area. The flashlight in his pocket was dead. The wind blew gently, carrying a musty smell. Then he heard footsteps coming from the direction of the trees. The sound of bare feet, walking on wet ground. Pak Samsul stood frozen. Sweat poured from his forehead. From the darkness, a pair of eyes appeared, red eyes glowing like embers, and slowly the body became visible. A woman with a large belly, long, tangled hair, and a face that was not entirely human. It was Sarni. Sarni, who had never left. Her hand pointed toward Pak Samsul. Her baby was crying, softly but continuously. The crying made Pak Samsul's teeth chatter. He stepped back, then fell to the ground. Sarni approached. The sound of her footsteps was like the sound of wet flesh. When she was only 2 meters away, she spoke, without moving her lips, but her words entered Pak Samsul's ears directly. "Why, Samsul? Why did you kill me?" Pak Samsul screamed, but no one heard him. He fainted in the middle of the road, under a fallen tree that seemed to have been sent from the sky. The next morning, the villagers found him lying on the ground with cuts on his arms, his clothes dirty, and his eyes wide open, unblinking. He was taken home. But from that day on, he refused to speak. He only sat there, staring blankly out the window. Every night, the villagers still heard the cries of a baby coming from inside his house. And the following night, the religious gathering at the village hall turned into the beginning of the peak of terror. That evening, the village hall had a different atmosphere. The lights were bright. Carpets were laid out. Prayer mats were neatly arranged, and dozens of residents sat in a circle, preparing to attend the monthly religious gathering. The soft recitation of prayers drifted from a small speaker hanging in the corner of the room. Pak Samsul, despite his trembling body and pale face, still came. He sat in the corner at the back, avoiding everyone's gaze. In front of him sat young people, mothers, and several elderly village leaders. Mbak Kens was there too, sitting cross-legged with her eyes closed. Exactly at 8 o'clock, the religious gathering began. However, 15 minutes after the opening prayer was recited, the speaker crackled. The electricity suddenly went out. The room was dark. Some people immediately turned on their cell phone flashlights. But before the light could spread fully, a sound was heard, the cry of a baby. The cry did not come from outside. It came from the middle of the room, from among the congregation. Several mothers fell silent. Children curled up against their parents. The crying changed. From a baby's whimper, it turned into a moan, then a long scream that made hearts skip a beat. Someone screamed. In the middle of the room, a woman appeared. Her clothes were torn, covered in blood. Her stomach was large as if she were heavily pregnant, but it was torn open. From the tear, fresh blood flowed, and the head of a baby could be seen crawling down to the floor. The baby squirmed. Its hands were bleeding. Its legs were broken, but it continued to crawl. Its small eyes looked around the room, and its cries did not stop, even though there was no mouth visible on its face. Some villagers fainted. Others could only cover their faces and hold their breath. Then, from behind, a loud voice emerged. A young girl named Sarni, who had been sitting in the corner since the beginning, screamed loudly and her body convulsed. She collapsed to the floor, then slowly rose with her head bowed. Her voice changed, becoming heavy and filled with hatred. Pax Samsel. Everyone turned. Mr. Samsel, look at me. Mr. Samsel, who had been sitting stiffly, began to shiver. His eyes widened, and his body slowly backed toward the wall. Sarni walked to the center of the room. Her eyes didn't blink. Blood dripped from her nose and ears. But her mouth kept talking. I waited 20 years. You thought I'd stay silent? She pointed at Mr. Samsel. You knew I was pregnant. You knew I couldn't fight you that night. You knew I never tried to kill myself. You were the one who choked me. You were the one who hung me from that tree, so everyone would think I was weak. Cries began to echo from various corners of the room. Some villagers closed their eyes, while others could only stare at Mr. Samsel in horror. Pax Samsel shouted, Enough! Stop! I'm afraid. I'm afraid everyone will find out. Sarni approached. You're afraid? Sarni was afraid that night too, but you didn't care. Then, from the floor, the red-faced baby who had been crawling was now near Sarni's feet. It cried softly, then raised its tiny hands toward Pax Samsel. Sarni picked up a small bamboo stick in the corner of the room, a decorative bamboo used as a marker for events. But the tip was sharp. She stepped slowly toward Pax Samsel, who was now sitting weakly. With a heavy voice and burning red eyes, Sarni, in Sarni's voice, said, For all the nights filled with blood, this is a revenge. And the bamboo was thrust straight into Pax Samsel's chest. Blood spurted onto the wall. The lights flickered back on briefly after Pax Samsel's body collapsed. Sarni fell, her body convulsing, then lost consciousness. The villagers could only stand in silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Only the sound of a baby's cry faded away among the lights that had returned. Outside the village hall, the wind stopped. Then heavy rain fell, as if the sky was crying for something that had finally ended or had just begun. After that bloody night of religious study, Samrajati village was plunged into a silence unlike anything it had ever experienced before. It was as if the entire village had held its breath. There was no crowing of roosters, no clinking of dishes from the kitchens, no laughter of children, and the rain fell relentlessly for 3 days. Water poured down in torrents, swallowing the dirt roads, battering the old roof tiles, and soaking the graves near the Waru Tree. The village seemed submerged in deep sorrow, soaking every corner, seeping into bones of the villagers still in shock from what they had witnessed. Pax Samsel's house was now abandoned. No one dared to enter. No one dared to touch his body after that night. Some villagers claimed they still saw the shadow of a woman at the window, standing with a baby in her arms, staring at the rain. On the third night of the rain, a loud noise came from the direction of the graveyard. It sounded like a large branch breaking. Some villagers mustered the courage to light a lamp and open the door, and they saw it. The Waru Tree had fallen. Its roots were pulled out of the ground, exposing the old grave next to it. The earth shifted and the tombstone cracked. The tree trunk split the wet ground and fell, forming a large indentation like an open wound on the village's body. The villagers gathered in the morning, witnessing the tree that no longer stood. Its leaves were scattered, its branches broken. But amidst the destruction, something was found in the hole where the roots had been. A tattered white cloth. Buried inside, tied with rotten rattan rope. When the villagers pulled the cloth, they found another object beneath it. Bones. Small, fragile, baby bones. A small scream was heard from one of the women who saw them. The villagers immediately called the village chief and the authorities. But everyone already knew. They knew who had been buried there in secret, who had been buried 20 years ago, not in an official grave, but under the roots of the tree considered haunted, so that it would never be found. Sarni and her baby. Sarni, who was believed to have committed suicide, was actually murdered and buried in secret, like a sin hidden away. The village finally held a talon and collective prayers, not as an exorcism, but as a form of apology. A cleric from outside the village led the prayers and suggested that Sarni and her baby's graves be moved to a proper place, given a proper headstone and named. However, even though her body now rests in peace, the rumors persist. Some villagers swore they heard the cries of a baby coming from the empty house belonging to Mr. Samsel. Children playing near the fields sometimes said they saw the woman with the baby, sitting near the old well, singing a lullaby no one had ever taught her. And every Friday night, at exactly 2 a.m, people passing by the former side of the Waru Tree often feel as though they are being watched. Perhaps the grudge has been settled, but the wound never truly heals. It rained for 3 days. The Waru Tree that once stood tall now lies fallen, revealing a wound long buried. Beneath the rotten roots, a forgotten body was found. Sarni and her baby. The village tried to move on, but the nights never truly grew calm again. Pack Samsel's house was left empty. Yet sometimes through the window, a figure of a woman can be seen standing, cradling a baby. And every Friday night, exactly at 2 a.m, the crying resounds once more. The crying that never ends.